Thank you very much for having me down here. It's always good to pay visits to Oxford from the far-flung parts of the north where I come from. I'd add to the list of books that Charles mentioned, I had a book published a couple of years ago called The Streetwise Guide to the Devil and All His Works. I wanted to call it The Life and Times of Satan, but the publisher wouldn't let me. But it was a history of the devil, basically, which is one of my many interests. Still available for those who want it. And I'd also mention the one he did touch on, the Apocalypse Next, which is a book about the economics of global catastrophic risks, which is things like asteroids striking the planet, pandemics that wipe out 99% of the human species, or super intelligent AI deciding that we're a nuisance and it's going to exterminate us, that kind of cheerful stuff. But that's not what I'm talking about tonight. As you've heard, I'm going to talk about the private provision of a very important public good, or supposed public good, which is welfare services of various kinds. Things like protection against exigencies such as loss of income from unemployment or sickness, health care, medical care of various kinds, but a whole range of other services as well. Now, today, these are almost entirely provided through the mechanism of the state. And in fact, this is pretty much the main thing that the state does in the 20th and 21st century world. Now, what people don't often realize is how much of a historical change that represents, because until the later 19th century, throughout the whole of human history actually, the overwhelming majority of government spending of all kinds is war. In pretty much every historical state, early modern Europe, medieval Europe, any other part of the world for that matter, you'll find that about 80 to 90% of all state spending is military spending. And most of what's left over from that is building fancy monuments to the kings who started the wars, big palaces and the like. But now, defence spending makes up a very small part of total state spending. The great majority of the state spending is on three big functions: education, health services and health spending, and income transfers of various kinds of welfare benefits, income transfers, cash transfers done through the medium of the tax system. This is true across the world. And the main reason why the state has grown from consuming 10% of British GDP or most other countries' GDP in the 1900s to consuming over 50% today is because of the growth of that function of government. So the big modern state in terms of share of GDP that it consumes is essentially the welfare state. Now, because of the fact that the government these days is the primary or in virtually sole provider of welfare, we tend to think that there's no other way of doing it. The kind of widespread popular conception is that absent this kind of action by government, there's not going to be anything. The historians know this is not true, but the kind of popular history, if you will, or the popular vision of the past hasn't caught up with what the historians know or realise. And in fact, this is not the case. Before the explosive growth of welfare state and welfare transfers in the 20th century, there was in fact a very large and elaborate system of non-state welfare, which was based on an entirely different set of organisational and fundamental principles. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain, first of all, give you a historical account of what that system was, how it worked, what its main features were. Then I'm going to address the question of how and why it disappeared, because it has pretty much. There are vestigial elements of it still surviving, but that's all they are, vestigial. Then I'm going to explain why this is particularly important in the here and now, because it has direct and immediate application to the state of affairs that not only the UK, but pretty much all developed countries are now facing. So, in the 19th century, 18th century, going back several hundred years, there was obviously nothing like the state welfare system that we have now. You did have the Poor Law after 1834, the new Poor Law, but this provided a really kind of minimal level of welfare support from government, which was deliberately and by design punitive. Under the rules of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, the only way you could get poor relief was to enter a workhouse. Now, in practice, this often was not enforced, but the threat of being made to go into the workhouse to get relief was always present, and the conditions in the workhouse were, by design, extremely harsh. This was done on the basis of something called the principle of less eligibility, which was that the condition of somebody in receipt of poor relief had to be worse than that of the lowest paid labourer. This was done quite deliberately in order to create an incentive not to go on to state welfare. Now, that meant that therefore, as far as most people were concerned in that century and previously, if you fell upon misfortune, you fell sick, you needed medical care, you were unemployed, you had no source of income, or indeed, if you wanted to have a number of services provided for you, you couldn't look to the poor law to do it, not unless you wanted to endure the privations of being put in what was effectively a prison, the workhouse. Now, the common presumption is that therefore there was nothing apart from charity. Now, charity, philanthropy, was indeed a major feature of 19th century European North American society. I could give you a whole lecture about charity and what philanthropy in the 19th century was like. But in fact, philanthropy was marginal, although the amounts given were actually very large, because the Victorian middle classes here in the UK gave on average 10 to 15% of their income to charity, which is a much larger proportion than most people give of their income today. It was even so, all that charitable work was a small part of the total welfare service. The bulk of welfare, before the creation of the welfare state, came from mutual aid. Now, what is mutual aid? Well, technically, it's collective self-help. The way in which mutual aid works is that ordinary people, working class people, lower middle class people, people without private means, people often of very slender means, would voluntarily associate and cooperate together in order to pool the resources they had to provide protection for the members of the association against the kind of events that I've just been talking about, sickness or ill health or the like. Now, these kind of voluntary associations grew out of and were related to medieval brotherhoods, religious brotherhoods and the like. One of the oldest, which became, as we'll see in a moment, a model for many of the others, was the Freemasons, which of course grew out of the Masonic guilds of the Middle Ages. But it was only one of many, many such organizations. Now, initially, many of these voluntary societies were what called local collection societies. Let's say we all live in a village, a small agricultural community, as most people did before the 1820s. What we would do is we would set up a kind of, literally a collection box, a society, and we would have regular meetings in the pub, of course, where else. And what we would do is we would bind ourselves through a mutual agreement to each of us make a small but regular contribution to the funds. Then if one of us fell on hard times or suffered, let's say, an injury or fell unemployed, they could then apply to the society for help out of the accumulated funds. That was the initial form which this took. Now, by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, there are many, many such local societies, and there are also lots of more specialised societies. In particular, there are an awful lot of burial societies. This is because for most people in the 19th century working class, and this is not just true of Britain, the worst possible fate you could have was to not have a good send-off, as they called it, to be buried in an unmarked grave, to receive a pauper's funeral. And so people who could save nothing else would actually save money simply to be sure that they got what they regard as a proper burial. But what you also get is the emergence of what became known as fraternal orders or friendly societies. Now, these are large voluntary organizations which, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, have tens of thousands, or even in some cases, hundreds of thousands of members. The way they work is that you join a local branch. Some of these are called lodges, after the Masonic example, but the individual friendly societies often call their branches by distinctive names of one kind or another. But the basic fact is it's a local branch or cooperative unit of a larger organization. The lodge is affiliated to an order, and the order pools the resources that the lodges have made, and it's organized on a national, or even in the case of the very largest ones, a transnational or global basis. So the very largest orders, like the Independent and Ancient Order of Oddfellows, or the Foresters, or the Shepherds, or the Druids, they have literally hundreds of thousands of members in various parts of the world. These are very, very large organisations. Now, they're run on a bottom-up basis. They are formed on the basis of voluntarism. The principle is that nobody is compelled to join one of these associations. You voluntarily opt to join a lodge. The lodges, in turn, freely associate together to form the affiliated order. If a lodge decides that it doesn't like the policy of the affiliated order, it can disaffiliate itself and leave. So there's an automatic right of secession or exit, if you will. The whole thing, in other words, is based on the principle of voluntary cooperation, voluntarism in terms of attaching yourself to the organisation. The organisation, moreover, is run on a bottom-up basis, so that the lodges will send representatives to a district committee or a district council, which in turn will elect representatives to a national council, and then in the case of the very largest orders, there will be a global body that regulates and governs the whole order. But the power flows upwards from the bottom. These are not franchises. You're not talking about a top-down administrative structure. You're talking instead about something where the ultimate authority lies with the individual members who have chosen to associate in the body. Now, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, you have across Europe and North America literally hundreds of these large affiliated orders, some of which are still quite well known. Like I mentioned, the Oddfellows, which actually suffer several splits, but the biggest known one is the Manchester Unity, which is still with us. The Honourable and Ancient Order of Gardeners, who claim to have been founded by Adam, because he was, of course, the first gardener, obviously. The Druids, the Shepherds, the Foresters, the Woodmen, the Moose. You may remember, if you've watched the Flintstones, that when Barney and Fred want to get away from Wilma and Betty, they go along to meetings with the Water Buffaloes Lodge, which is actually a kind of satire on the Elks, which is another famous American friendly society. Now, by the time you get to the 1890s, 90% of all British men of working age belong to a friendly society. Now, the participation of women is less, because most women who are married get what are called spousal benefits if their husband is a member of the order. So the participation rate as full members for women is about 45 to 50%. There are a number of orders which are peculiarly and solely for women. So as well as the spousal benefit aspect, there are things you can join as a woman in your own right if you wish to do so. Most of them stick with the spousal benefits, though, a slight majority of them. Now, what kind of benefits do you get from being a member of a friendly society? What do these friendly societies actually do? Well, a lot more than just paying for your funeral. In fact, they provide the entire range of functions that is now provided by the welfare state, other than top-up income transfers. They don't do that. So they provide, for example, a whole range of services, leisure and entertainment, for example. The lodge will often, or typically in fact, either own its own premises or hire them, and those premises are then used for entertainment, parties, meetings, educational provision and the like. The friendly societies are deeply involved in education. They provide all kinds of educational services to their members. They provide also, however, and this is the crucial thing, a whole range of welfare benefits of several kinds. The most important is that they provide protection against interruption to income through unemployment or sickness or other accidents, as you might call them. They also increasingly, towards the end of the 19th century, provide old age pensions. They provide, they invest some of the funds that they get from their members, and they provide, out of the investment returns that they get, they provide payment for stipends for those of their members who are now too old to actually engage in gainful employment. They also provide an enormous range of health benefits. The larger orders actually own subscription hospitals. which have been built and set up out of subscriptions raised for that specific purpose from the wider public, not just their own members, but the hospitals are owned, in this case, directly by the Friendly Society. However, that's not the main thing they do. The main thing they do is something called lodge practice. What they do is that the lodge, or indeed the entire order in some cases, will have contracts with doctors by which the doctors are obliged to provide free medical care to, medical care free to the user, that is, to the members of the order. Now, the way this works is that the members of the order pay as part of their sub a specific payment, which is to get the health benefits. What the lodge then does is to pay the doctor a flat rate, so much per member that the lodge or the order has. And the doctor, in return for this flat rate payment, is obliged to provide the services when called upon to do so by the members. Now, by the way, and something I'll return to, the doctors absolutely hate this. They are really, really not a fan of this, but they have no excuse or way not to take on the lodge practice. You could, of course, not take on the lodge practice, but unless you were a very successful and famous doctor, that was actually really a case of cutting off your nose to spite your face, because lodge practice was a regular guaranteed stream of income and a very large stream of income, given that friendly societies are organising the great majority of the working age population, as I just said. So they're providing, as I say, the entire range of welfare functions. The only thing they don't provide, which you do get in the modern welfare state, is top-up payments. These are now the largest single payments in the case of the British welfare state. It's things like universal credit, pension supplements, this kind of thing, which mainly introduced by Gordon Brown, although what Gordon Brown actually did was to consolidate and extend what had previously been called supplementary benefit, or thereafter income support, which is the same idea. It's the idea that you take somebody who's on low pay and you top up their income. They never did that. Now, one of the reasons why they didn't was because that had been the widespread practice of the Poor Law before the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834, under what was called the Speen-Hamlin system, where the income of households was topped up out of the poor rates until it reached a level where you could afford to buy a certain amount of bread, and therefore the level of support was a function of the price of bread, basically. This had proved to be a total disaster, as was widely recognised throughout the period before, really the 1950s or 60s. And so the friendly societies and indeed the Poor Law just would have nothing to do with this. In fact, it was the collapse of that system that had provoked the creation of the new Poor Law in 1834. But apart from that, they do everything. They run holiday homes, they run old people's homes, they run holiday trips for their members. Pretty much any service you can imagine is done through these voluntary associations. Now, the contributions that people have to make are typically very modest. Obviously, this is one of the things that drives the development of large affiliated orders, because they benefit from economies of scale. If you have 100,000 members, then that's a lot of annual subs. And you can do things like buying in products in bulk, buying medical care in bulk through the lodge practice system and things of that sort. Also, these friendly societies and mutual aid associations are extremely effective and efficient in terms of the way that they deliver these welfare services. The reason is that they are able to take advantage of and make use of the dispersed knowledge of their members. Suppose the way in which this is administered is not bureaucratic or process or rule bound. Now, I need to qualify that. There are rules, very clear rules, which are in the membership rules of the organisation that you join. But what you don't have is the kind of highly intrusive rules and regulations that you will find if you're unfortunate enough to be a welfare recipient today, if you're unfortunate enough to be in receipt of universal credit, for example. The thing is, let's say I am a member of a lodge, you're all the fellow lodge members, some of you are the lodge committee, and I come along to the lodge and I say that I'm applying for relief because I've fallen sick and I can't work anymore. You will have lots of detailed direct personal knowledge about me and my circumstances because you live right around me. You probably work with me, half of you. Therefore, if I am indeed a malingerer, or my ill health is the product of something like what they used to call riotous living, which is a thing from the prodigal son, of course, which means typically alcoholism or something like that, then you will know that I'm an undeserving case and you will not support me. On the other hand, you may decide that, you are going to give me some help, but you'll insist that I, sign the pledge and, give up the drink or something like that. Or you will know enough about me to know that this is a claim made in good faith and you'll give me the benefit. The point is that the system draws upon and makes use of lots of personal knowledge, which is dispersed and scattered amongst all of the members of the order or society, whatever it may be. I should add, by the way, that alongside the large affiliated orders which had begun to appear in the early 19th century, there are lots and lots of the smaller local societies still existing. Now, this whole system, as I say, is enormously elaborate, and you find it in pretty much every country in the world, European country. You do find counterparts, by the way, in other parts of the world. There's a major system very like this in China, which I don't have time to talk about. A lot of which purport to be secret societies in the Chinese case, usually Buddhist or Taoist, but it's the same kind of system. Similarly, in India, widespread existence of this, and in the Islamic world, you have, of course, the whole institutionalized practice of zakat, which is one of the 5 pillars of the faith. It's usually translated as charity, but that's actually not quite capturing the full range of what it is. And that again involves voluntary donations to various kinds of charitable cause. There's also the formal institution of the Waqf, which is a kind of charitable foundation that has special protection for its assets and income under Islamic law. But talking purely about what you might call the Western world, the British Empire, the United States, Western Europe, if you go into almost any country, you will find institutions of this kind. There are others alongside them, by the way, which I'll briefly mention before I move on. Things such as voluntary savings banks, for example, which are a huge financial institution or sector. Of building societies here in the UK, but particularly in Germany, there are many, many others. In Germany in particular, you get the Raiffeisen savings banks, and the Sparkasse, many of which still exist, created mainly by a man called Anton Schulze-Delitzsch, who is a leading liberal politician in 19th century Germany and a great advocate of the whole voluntary system. Now, these societies then are flourishing, they're growing. If you look at the records for membership over the course of the 19th century, their penetration, as you might say, is steadily increasing. But now they've all gone. Quite a few of these orders have simply disappeared. The Rechabites, for example, who are one of the largest orders based in Salford, they only have a couple of lodges left. They're pretty much extinct. Others have simply converted themselves into commercial insurance companies. They're no longer voluntary associations. The Liverpool Victoria, for example, which was a very large friendly society, is now just a regular commercial insurance company, the LVI, nominally a mutual owned by its policyholders, but it's no longer a grassroots membership organisation. There are a few still going. The Foresters are still going. The Oddfellows are still staggering along, and they've very firmly stuck to still having a lodge organisation. You'll also still occasionally find branches of my own favourite friendly society, the RAOB, which stands for the Royal and Antediluvian Order of Buffaloes. Antediluvian meaning that supposedly they were founded before the flood, before the time of Noah, which does lead to some interesting theology, but let's not go into that. Really, these are, as I said, vestigial. This whole system has collapsed. Now, why did it disappear? Well, for several reasons. One reason is through deliberate and systematic legislative action designed to destroy large parts of what they do. In particular, you find that in country after country, notably the United States, but also the United Kingdom, deliberate legislation is used to destroy lodge practice and the provision of healthcare services by voluntary associations and friendly societies, which includes trades unions, by the way. The dividing line between a trades union and a friendly society is very blurred. There are many organisations which are, you could put it into whichever category you feel like. Now, why did this happen? Well, it's due to the lobbying of an extremely powerful and influential pressure group, the doctors. In country after country, it is the organised medical profession that is most hostile to friendly societies, and which also typically is disproportionately influential or represented in the legislature. This is most extreme in the United States, where certain state legislatures are in a position where literally 40% of their members are doctors, clinical practitioners. So not surprisingly, they're very open to claims. What is the point or purpose of this measure? Well, it's to increase doctors' income. And in the critical point in the British case is the passage of the creation of national insurance by Lloyd George in the so-called People's Budget of 1909, finally passed, of course, over a year later, 2 years later actually. And what that did was to effectively make it impossible for friendly societies to continue it. They tried to do this, but by the time you get to the 1920s, they pretty much pulled out of a lot of the healthcare provision. They're withdrawing from it at a great rate. What this leads to is a near trebling of doctors' income, because they're now able to charge people on an individual basis. And what this does, of course, is to put a lot of medical services beyond the pocket of large numbers of people. And this, more than anything else, is what then provides the impetus for the measure to create the National Health Service after World War II, which, by the way, would almost certainly have happened regardless of which party won the election in 1945. It would have taken a different form had the Conservatives won the election, but they were going to bring in something very, very similar. And the reason was that the doctors, through their lobbying and the legislation that Parliament had very foolishly passed at their behest, had effectively destroyed the major source of healthcare funding for the great majority of the working class population. And that meant that there was obviously a really severe problem, and the creation of the National Health Service was the response to this. Not, however, the thought of doing away with the doctors' special privileges and powers, which had grown consistently throughout the period after 1918. By the way, another aspect of this was the passage of the Dangerous Drugs Act in 1922, which was the measure that first outlawed a whole range of drugs and made a whole range of other drugs prescription only, so that you had to go to a doctor to get them. Before then, you could just go to a pharmacist, an apothecary as they call them, and get them. That's why Arthur Conan Doyle, the chap who created Sherlock Holmes, of course, notorious cokehead, was able to trot down to the local chemist and get his supply of white powder to, snort up his nose and so on. This was regarded as extremely dodgy, especially for a doctor, which he was, of course, but it was perfectly legal. But what happened was that in 1922, the doctors got the sole right to issue medicine, and for a fee, of course. And then what this did was also to increase the cost of medicines dramatically, because there's now a big rent being paid to the doctor who's writing the prescriptions. So that's one reason. The other reason is deliberate action by governments to do this. Now, why do they want to do it? Well, the man who creates the welfare state is Bismarck in the so-called Sozialpolitik of 1878. Bismarck is very frank and clear about why he is doing this. Characteristically so. He was not a man who believed in mincing his words or beating about the bush, shall we say. And in his speech to the Reichstag, in which he introduced state health insurance, state old age pensions and all the other benefits, his argument was that this was necessary in order to, first of all, make the citizens of the newly unified Germany more loyal to the state, as opposed to loyal to the trades unions, the friendly societies or the Catholic Church, which he was having a huge row with at the time. But also because it made these people easier to control. And the word he used to describe this is a German verb which actually literally means to grab hold of and grip something, behandeln. And that's what he says. He says basically, a man who is in receipt of a state pension or payment is much easier to control than one who is not. And so there's a very hard-headed realpolitik motive behind government's expansions of income transfers and welfare functions. They're no longer being delivered by private institutions, voluntary institutions that the state does not control. They're now being delivered by the state. And this creates dependency on the state by design, because that is what Bismarck and the other politicians who followed in his train wanted to achieve. It's all part of the system, along with things like mass conscription and other things of that sort, which is designed to create both loyalty on the part of the citizens and also dependency by those citizens on the ruling class, if you will, the political elite that controls the state. So that's the second big reason. Now, the third reason follows on from that, and that is the phenomenon of crowding out. Once the state has taken over this function, it tends to crowd out the private supply. There's no need ultimately to pass laws banning the friendly societies in the way in which it had been done with lodge practice and their healthcare provisions. It just happens anyway, because increasingly, if you can go and get these resources from the state, or if the state is going to provide you with these benefits, whether you want them or not in many cases, there's no point in then, on top of that, in addition to all the taxes you're paying, making voluntary contributions. Now, why does all this matter? Well, it matters for a whole number of reasons. The first reason is that what this actually does is show very clearly that you do not need the state to provide a flexible, near universal, and highly effective form of welfare cover. Covering the whole array of services that are now provided by the government, and a number of others that the government still does not provide, like the holiday stuff and so on, and much more effectively than the state can do so. The idea that there is the alternative to the government providing all the benefits that it does is people literally starving in the street, or outright destitution, or serious poverty. That, in theory, in pure empirical evidence, that is not true. However, what is the case now is that the 100 years we've had, really, of state welfare has, as I said, destroyed these civil society voluntary institutions. The problem we have now is this: if the welfare state is significantly reduced, if it were to be, let's say, turned off tomorrow, the result would indeed be disaster, because the institutions that could pick up the slack are not there. And it will take some time, a considerable time probably, for them to re-emerge or be reconstituted. And that would be very, very unpleasant and politically unsustainable, of course. You can see the way in which this works from the experience we've had with so-called austerity under Cameron and Osborne during the coalition government and subsequently. What happened with that austerity was that the actual level of state spending was only reduced by about 5%. Yet at the same time, it wreaked absolute havoc on a whole range of state services. Now, why was this? Well, one reason was because Cameron and Osborne deliberately ring-fenced large areas of public spending: education, the health service, both of those explicitly, and implicitly what is called social protection, income transfers. They didn't increase them by as much as they had been intended to be increased, but they still increased them slightly nonetheless, and they certainly didn't cut them. What that meant was that in order to get a 5% cut in overall government spending, you had to cut the areas that were cut, which is about 20 to 25% of government spending, by up to 45 or 50%. So things like local government, law and order, the Ministry of Justice, they had 50% cuts. So in fact, actually, paradoxically, what happened under Cameron and Osborne was that what you might call the core functions of the state, the functions that pretty much everyone thinks the government should provide unless you're an anarchist, they were cut back to the bone and severely damaged in the process, actually, including defence, by the way, which is one of the reasons why the British Armed Forces are a total bloody joke at the moment. But the welfare transfers were left untouched. Even so, because they did not increase as much as had been planned, the results there were very, very damaging. Now, what all this brings me to, the sort of reason why this idea of voluntary association matters, is that the British welfare state, in common with most other welfare states, is not going to survive. It is simply unsustainable given the situation that we are now facing, the demographic and economic situation that we're now in. The only way that the kind of welfare obligations that the British government is committed to meeting, mainly pension obligations, is if the British economy grows at about 6 or 7%. Now, since it has never grown at that rate in its entire history, you wouldn't bet on that happening. In fact, the long-run trend growth rate in the UK economy is about just under 2%. So the chances of getting even above that are extremely low to non-existent. But the point is that because we have an aging population, and because of the chronic ill health of a very large part of the population, the welfare demands on the state are on a kind of relentless up escalator. They're going to keep on going up. At the same time, taxation is now at an all-time record level for peacetime. There has never been a level of taxation as high as what we have now in peacetime. And we are actually beyond the maximum taxable capacity of the British state, British public, if you will, the British state. One of the kind of basic structural facts is that outside wartime, the British state has never been able to raise more than about 35 to 38% of the national income in tax revenue. Even if taxes are set at a level higher than that, as they are at the moment, you find that in practice, you only get 38% of national income in revenue because people change their behaviour in ways that reduces their tax liability. So you don't actually get the amount of tax that the nominal rates suggest you should. So we are now in a very bad situation. We're in a situation where welfare payments, which are necessary for many people, can no longer be sustained given the pretty dire outlook for future growth at the moment and the aging of the population. And at the same time, something is going to have to give. Now, what this means is that what we need to do as a matter of urgency, if you will, is to recreate the kind of institutions and systems that we had 100 and 150 years ago. Because better that we start to recreate these institutions now than we suddenly find that the welfare state collapses and there's nothing there to pick up the slack. Now, this is obviously a major challenge, but I think it's something that we should all be thinking about and we should be doing. One of the ways in which you can do this is that these friendly societies and other voluntary organisations provided purely private goods as well as public goods. Things which were like the leisure and entertainment functions which I mentioned. And so it's a classic example of how you can get voluntary action to provide a public good, which is to associate the public good, which has the quality of non-excludability in some cases, with a private good or a club good, which is what friendly societies do. And this is probably a way of reviving this kind of voluntary principle in a number of ways. There's finally one way in which these things matter, and this is the final aspect of the difference between voluntary institutions of this kind and the kind that we're familiar with. The modern world, the world that we've been in since roughly the end of the 18th century, is one that is increasingly dominated by complex processes. We live in a highly complex society. Now, the question arises, well, when you're living in a very large society with 8 billion global population, very complex processes needed to feed all these people, clothe them, house them, do all the other things that are necessary for living a decent life. How do you organise these activities? Now, the model of organisation that the friendly societies embody is one of dispersed knowledge and bottom-up organisation and coordination. And if you think about historically, that is the way that a lot of services and functions are organised. We're sat here in an Oxford college. This is what Oxford and Cambridge were like, and to some extent still are like. The college originally is literally like a kind of club or association of scholars, and the university in turn is an association of colleges. Very different from the top-down model of the university that the Germans invented in the second half of the 19th century, again under Bismarck, although it began before him, to be fair. There's a kind of decentralized model of running complex, large institutions, one that makes use of tacit knowledge. Now, the contrary way of organising things is the one that you find not only in government, but also in large firms and corporations. And this is the top-down, structured model, where power and decisions are made at the top and flow down, or at least they used to. Because what these institutions are also dominated by is the rule of process, as opposed to judgment. So I emphasise that in the way the friendly societies worked, the individual knowledge of local members was used to guide and form decisions about the practical matters of what they were doing. Now, by contrast, in modern large institutions, whether you're talking about large firms or governments, individual decision-making is reduced to the absolute minimum. Instead, what you have are processes and procedures that are followed. Now, if you think about it, in recent years, the British state has been associated with a whole number of catastrophic disasters and miscarriages of justice. The whole to do with the post office and the Horizon scandal, for example, the Grenfell Tower disaster, the whole confusion and serious injustice done over the Windrush families by the Home Office, the tainted, toxic blood scandal from the 1970s. In each of these cases, what is striking is that apparently nobody is responsible. You can't actually point to any one person and say, oh, they made the decision that was responsible for this. Instead, what everybody says is, well, I just did what the procedures told me to do. And it's the procedures that have led to this catastrophic outcome. And that's because we live increasingly in a world where we are governed by large top-down formal institutions which are run not on the basis of personal accountability and individual decision-making, whether by the people at the top or further down the chain of command, but by impersonalised processes. And this has reached the point where, as the current government is discovering, and the previous government also found out, even if you're the minister or the prime minister, you discover that you're pulling on all these levers of power, supposedly, and bugger all is actually happening because you don't control. The whole thing is like a self-running machine, which you no longer have any kind of control or say over. And so what friendly societies were an example of, and I say an example because there are other instances, is of a different way of organising large, complex processes, which are an inevitable feature of the kind of complex society that we live in and which the modern world has produced. And so it's a model of organisation for a whole range of activities and functions that we need to recover. And what I would do is throw out here an allusion to the works of the Ostroms, Eleanor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom, particularly Vincent, actually, I think, as much as Lynn, which is very much concerned with how to reconstruct governance in a more polycentric, decentralised, bottom-up form. So hopefully I've given you some sort of like interesting historical account of what I think is a very little known and little studied subject, which is remarkable because these friendly societies have left behind incredibly voluminous records. I mean, there's masses of raw source material for the historian to use, but very few historians have studied them because of the amazingly, to use a technical term, Whiggish approach to the history of the welfare state, which is a classic example of Whig history as it's known, where basically the entire history of the past is recounted as though it was a story which somehow led up to the present day and which is seen as being explained by and justified insofar as it leads up to that present state of affairs. And what that means is that things that don't fit into that Whig story, if you will, the friendly societies and others are simply ignored and overlooked. There are a couple of works I would mention, I'll finish with this. One is by an American historian, a friend of mine, called David Beito, spelled B-E-I-T-O, and he's got a book called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State. Very good book, which looks at a whole array of the way friendly societies, fraternal orders, the Americans call them, worked. And he has chapters which look at specific cases. One was how the Loyal Order of Moose created a system of orphanages purely out of their voluntary contributions. And the other is how a black friendly society, and by the way, African American participation in friendly societies was significantly higher than amongst white Americans. It was one of the major features of African American life in the period up to the 1960s. In the Mississippi, the poorest state of the United States then and now, were able, through voluntary action, to build a large hospital, which is still there, by the way, down there in the Delta, in the western part of the state. The other person to mention is a man called David Green, who used to work at the IEA. He then left the IEA and went off to found Civitas. He's gone over to the dark side and become an economic nationalist, I'm afraid. But he did do a lot of extremely good work on the history of friendly society. He wrote a series of short books, both for the IEA and on his own account. And the best is probably his PhD, which he wrote up and published as a book with the title Working Class Patients and the Medical Establishment, which tells in great detail the story I outlined to you very, very briefly here about the way in which the doctors in the 1900s and 1920s basically strangled the voluntary provision of healthcare through the friendly societies and others. But at that point I'll stop.